nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram itam Sri Radhika prana natapada sarojayo yena premanubhutyasha dattam tam Shri Gurum bhaje Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananyabhilashojitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shajvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payorasho Muda Kedato Bande Bhagavatani Mananulabam Mudna Nipatyakshito Namah Shri Krishna Chandraya Nirupadi Kripa Krite Ya Shri Chaitanya Rupa Bhut Tanvan Prema Rasam Kalo Tadrisha Bhavam Bhavam Pratayutumihayo Avataram Ayataha Adurjana Ghana Sharanam Sajayati Chaitanya Vigraha Krishna Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Guti Matsarvasva Parambujo Radha Madana Mohano Adadanas Trinam Dantoir Yacheham Puna Puna Srimad Rupa Parambuja Rajoham Syam Bhave Bhave Abhirapali Patiputra Kanta Dasya Bilashati Balashvavara Shri Rupa Chintamala Sapti Sangsto Matsvanta Durdhanta Hechurastam Raganugami Bhajano Lasamanasanam Shri Radhaya Sahasara Smaratam Brajendhum Shri Rupa Pada Kamala śruti-śaṣkulīm me Chittam Satam Madhukari Pada Padme Bhaktir Yagnikilarta Varga Jananiya Brahma Sakshat Kriter Anandatishaya Prada Vishayajat Sokyad Vimuktir Yaya Shri Radha Ramanam Parabja Yugam Yasya Mahan Ashrayo Yakarya Brajalokavat Gurutara Prem Naiva Tasyai Nama Yaram Yanikilaga Shanga Shamani Shotratritim Sangata Yasvadya Rasikai Sukabdi Janani Dhikarya Mukti Spriha Yadhyata Hridaye Vrajendra Tanuja Premamrita Syandini Sajiyat Hari Bhakta Vrinda Mohita Dhanyeha Padyavali. So, by the grace of Sri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojanavatar Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar Sri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of Gaudiya Vaishnavacharjas, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. Again, today we'll continue our discussion of Padyavali. And we begin today a new prakaran, Atha Tesham Dainyokti. Now their expressions of humility. So the previous prakaran was that of Bhakta Mahatmya, or the greatness of Bhagavan's Bhaktas. So having explained something of their greatness, now the compiler, Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad, presents a series of verses. We'll find some 11-12 verses in this section, which showcase the manner in which bhaktas express humility, or dainya. So, this might appear peculiar, or in other words, in the conventional sense, the state of dainya or dinata, to be in a lowly position, to be in a needy position, to be in a state of disconcertion, this is not the first thing we think of when we hear about glory or greatness. So to have just described how great these bhaktas are, and then to immediately describe themselves expressing this state of lowliness, this state of longing, this state of heartache, this could appear like a contradiction to some. So what we can appreciate from this structuring of the text by Sri Rupa Gosvami Prabhupada is how central dainya is to the character of a bhakta. That if we've just explained how great these bhaktas are, then what's the first thing else we're going to hear about them? We're going to hear about their feeling of being not great, even though they are so great. Or having just described how great they are, now we see how they perceive themselves, or how they feel themselves to be, which is, as we discussed in our discussion of Trinadapi Sunichata, in reference to Sriman Mahaprabhu's third verse in the Shikshastakam, that bhaktas, despite being supremely exalted, feel themselves to be inadequate, feel themselves to be devoid of that state, because they feel within themselves always a lack of bhakti to Bhagavan, a lack of success in their aspiration to love and serve Bhagavan. So that heartache, that state of bhyagra or disconcertion that Sanatana Gosvami discusses throughout Brihad Bhagavatamrita, here in this section we now come to examples in which bhaktas express this state of humility, or express this condition of the heart known as dainya. So this does indeed, if not as much or as more as anything else does, show their greatness. In other words, that they are so great, and yet at the same time feel themselves to be so humble, feel themselves to be in a state of a lack of success, and feel themselves to be so hungry for more. This is wonderful, or this is amazing, that they could be so exalted and at the same time so filled with aspiration, so filled with the pursuit of more. And this also upholds in conventional analysis, in that when it comes to sport or arts or something like that, they have conventional sayings like, when the going gets tough, the tough get going, or that, those who are the best are those who always keep getting better. So in other words, just to achieve a particular status is not what makes someone great, but the fact that they themselves are constantly improving, they themselves are constantly becoming even greater perpetually, that is real greatness. So how is it that these bhaktas are not only great, but always becoming greater? We can say that the drive within that is their dainya, is this feeling of a lack of successfulness, is this feeling of a lack of bhakti within themselves, which is made possible by the intensity of their desire for bhakti, the intensity of their longing to render service so as to satisfy Bhagavan. So, as always, everything boils down to that central bhakti vasana, or that central sanskar of aspiring to serve Krishna for Krishna's pleasure, or what is sometimes known as tat sukha tatparya, or that one's intent is always upon his satisfaction in the midst of one's service. So because Krishna has an insatiable appetite for service, for prema, this creates an eternal opportunity, or an eternal state of aspiring, and gives rise to this humility perpetually, even in the hearts of the greatest of bhaktas. So, this is a little bit about why this prakaran comes next in the text. So now we'll look at the first verse in the prakaran. So, one other point of note is that the first 3 verses in this prakaran are by Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad himself, and they're all found in the Stavamala. So they come in a different order, however, than they're found in the Stavamala. So we'll look today at the first of these that he presents here. So, verse 59. Nāmāni praṇayena te sukṛtināṁ tanvanti tuṇḍotsavaṁ dhāmāni prathayanti Hanta jalada-śyāmāni netrāñjanam sāmāni śruti-śaṣkulīm muralikā-jātāny alaṅkurvate kāmānirvṛta-cetasām vibho nāśāpi śobhate. Could we close this door? I'm feeling the sound is a little distracting. Okay, thank you. So, rendered as follows. Your names create a festival for the mouths of the meritorious by means of love, or praṇayena. The rays of your light, deep blue like a raincloud, spread collyrium on their eyes. The songs produced by your flute ornament the passage of their ears. O vibho, Hanta, hear even the aspiration of we from whose minds kama has not receded, does not shine. I'm going to read it one more time. Your names create a festival for the mouths of the meritorious by means of love. The rays of your light, deep blue like a raincloud, spread collyrium on their eyes. The songs produced by your flute ornament the passages of their ears. But O vibho, Hanta, even the aspiration of we from whose minds kama has not receded, does not shine. So we'll discuss how the commentators in this case have analyzed this verse. So when I say the commentator, I refer to Viracandra Gosvami Prabhupada, the author of the Rasika-rangada-tika, whose commentary we're following throughout the Padyavali. But in this case, as I explain, Baladevidibhushan Pad has also written a commentary on the Padyavali, on the Stavamala. So we also will discuss how he's commented on this verse in his commentary on the Stavamala. So in some cases we'll see how they've commentated on things differently and drawn out different imports from the statement of Sri Rupa Gosvami Pad. The commentator explains that, quote, the meritorious, sukṛtināṁ, spoken of in this verse are those who are possessed of great purity, that is, those who are desireless, nishkama, of anything other than Bhagavan and bhakti to him. So, kriti would literally mean someone who's accomplished, so sukṛtīn would be one who's accomplished something good. So in a literal sense, it means someone who's meritorious, or someone who's achieved merit by having accomplished a good action. However, less literally, the word kriti as well as sukriti is often used to refer to someone who is great in a more general sense. And then that general sense is then applied contextually to refer to other things than specifically actions. So in this context, the commentator is saying that the meritorious, or the persons who are of great deed in this case, are those who are completely pure, which is to say desireless. So we typically think of greatness in the world of people who perform various feats. But from another perspective, when you're in a world which is inherently negative, or in a world which is delusional, and in a world in which suffering is primary and satisfaction is only a semblance, then to be non-engaged or to have not performed various things in the world could be conceived of as great, more so than those who have done many things within it. Or in other words, those who are desireless of the things of this negative plane, they're the great ones, rather than the persons who are perceived to be great in the world of the delusion. In other words, to be considered great by a bunch of ignorant people in a delusional space makes you great, yeah, but also not. And rather, when in that context, someone who's desireless of anything of that plane from an impartial perspective or a spiritual perspective, that is the great one. So this is how the commentator takes it. So now he applies this idea that Sri Krishna's names create a festival for the mouths of such bhaktas, quote, by means of love, means that out of love for such bhaktas, they create delight for their mouths, by manifesting in the forms of most relishable syllables and sounds. So elsewhere in the Shikshastakam, Sriman Mahaprabhu describes Bhagavan's names as being imbued with all his potency, and his doing such, or making his names available as such, as his great mercy upon jivas of this world. So this instrumental word pranaya in the verse, as we'll see, is interpreted in two ways. In one way, it's interpreted in reference to something that refers to something quote-unquote done by a bhakta, and in the other interpretation, refers to something done by the names, who are the agent in the sentence. So the commentator takes the word pranaya in reference to the names. So the names are, with love, making this festival in the mouths of bhaktas, which is a roundabout way of saying Krishna's self-manifestation of himself in the form of these beautiful names that his bhaktas can sing is itself a manifestation of his love for his bhaktas. The fact that he makes these beautiful names of himself available and able to be sung so as though create a festival or a celebration in the mouth of a bhakta can be felt to be a gesture of Bhagavan's love. So to chant the name of Bhagavan is itself to feel loved by Bhagavan, or to have received his love in the form of the opportunity to chant his beautiful names. So the bhakta here, in the spirit of humility, is cherishing this grace of Bhagavan, of manifesting in this non-different form of himself, of his name, which is a wish-fulfilling jewel and a conscious embodiment of, spiritual relish or rasa, and is pure and free from all the taint of the mundane and so forth, as per this famous statement, Nama Chintamani Krishnas Chaitanya Rasa Vigraha Purna Shuddha Nitya Mukto Abhinatvam nāmāni. And the name is such because it's non-different than the bearer of the name, meaning Bhagavan himself. So that Bhagavan self-manifests himself in his name. This is a profound act of grace, a profound act of love towards his bhaktas. So bhaktas, chanting his names, relish both the sounds of them, the beauty of them, as well as this gesture or this perpetual extension of himself in the form of his name that comes from Bhagavan. So this is one way it's read. The verse under discussion and the two that follow it here in Padyavali are also found in the compiler's Stavamala. And Sri Baladeva Dibhushan Pad, in his commentary on Stavamala, alternately explains that the mention of, quote, the meritorious, or sukṛtināṁ, in this verse refers to those who are highly adept in bhajan, or worship, of Sri Krishna. So, as we said, sukriti can mean one who's accomplished an excellent action. So of all excellent actions, what are there, right? Bhakti to Bhagavan will be the ultimate action, or the finest of all actions. So a quote, performer of an excellent act ultimately refers to one who has excellently performed bhakti, or who is highly adept in performance of bhakti, or bhajan. So Baladeva Vibhushan, in that sense, takes the word sukṛtināṁ to refer to a great bhakta, and in a plural. So read in this way, that the Sri Krishna's names creating a festival for the mouths of such bhaktas, quote, by means of love, implies that they do this by means of the prema that manifests from the worship such bhaktas offer to Sri Krishna. So in Baladeva Vibhushan's viewpoint, the names of Bhagavan create a festival in the mouths of those bhaktas because those bhaktas have prema for Bhagavan. In other words, he is emphasizing the role of the bhav, of the bhakta, in the name being experienced to be like a source of great delight, or to be like a festival. In that we might observe in the world that many people might chant these names and not feel that way. If they're not a bhakta, they might even get annoyed by hearing a Harinam Sankirtan loudly going past their house, or past them on the street, if they're interested in other things at that moment. So we don't see that these names necessarily universally create festivals in the mouths, or create delight for everyone always. Who do they create delight for? Bhaktas, or people who have love for Bhagavan, for those names. So Baladeva Vibhushan reads it in that sense, that by these great bhaktas, by virtue of their advanced bhakti, or by virtue of their excellent absorption in bhakti, have reached the state of being blessed with prema, and it's by virtue of that prema that these bhaktas feel and experience these names to be like a festival for the mouth. So, both interpretations are appreciable in my personal viewpoint. Baladeva Vibhushan's point is certainly consistent with the, discussion of bhakti and priti that we find in the Sandarbhas of Jiva Gosvami, and the idea of the names of Bhagavan being themselves a loving extension of Bhagavan's grace. This is also appreciable and fine. So grammatically both are acceptable, so we cherish them both. The implication of Sri Baladeva Vibhushan's statement is that the spreading of collyrium on the eyes and ornamentation of the ears, spoken of in the verse, like the delight for the mouth, spoken of in the first line, are also made possible by Bhakta's prema for Krishna. So in other words, just as it's because Bhaktas have prem that they feel these names to be like a festival, similarly it's because Bhaktas have prem that darshan of Krishna feels like this, the eyes are being anointed with a medicating, nourishing ointment, and that the music made by Krishna's flute or is like something ornamenting or enriching their ears. So, in other words, because the word pranaya is as an instrumental form, it can be taken to apply to all three of the verbs later in the verse, not only the verb in the first verse. In that way, the interpretation flushes out further. Okay. Sri Baladeva Vibhushan Pad further comments that the mention in the verse of, quote, the rays of your light, dhāmāni, refers to the radiance of Sri Krishna's figure. This radiance resembles the deep blue hue of rain clouds, and its spreading collyrium on their eyes implies that it remains fixed in the eyes, that is, in the sight of the mind's eye of bhaktas, just as collyrium remains fixed on physical eyes after it is applied to them. So if you apply collyrium to the eye, it remains there, it nourishes the eye, it brings ultimately a feeling of satisfaction to the eye. So when someone has darshan of Krishna's radiance, then that remains fixed, if you will, in their mind's eye, or it makes such a mark upon them that even if they look at other objects later, they still quote unquote see, or their eyes still feel the presence of that radiance of Krishna because it is such a rich, nourishing, relishable sight. So in that way it's comparable to anointing the eyes with collyrium. The commentator alternately interprets the word dhāmāni to mean beautiful forms, or śrimurtayaha, rather than rays of light, and takes the statement to mean that Sri Krishna's beautiful forms, endowed with the deep blue hue of rain clouds, spread coolness for the eyes like collyrium. That is, they delight the eyes, just as rain clouds produce delight with their rich, deep blue appearance and the fresh, cooling air they spread. So, the light from Krishna's figure, or Krishna's figure itself, you could take it in either way. One commentator takes it one way, one commentator takes it the other way. In either case, the idea is that Krishna's appearance, be it his radiance specifically or his form in general, resembles that of a deep blue rain cloud and produces such a soothing, what in English we have the phrase sight for sore eyes, so to speak. So as you apply collyrium as an ointment, if you have, quote, sore eyes or eyes that need treatment, then Krishna's sight, the sight of Krishna is also a, quote, sight for sore eyes, in that they bring a rich, cooling, soothing sight which makes a deep impression upon the seer, just as a rain cloud may come and produce fresh, cooling breeze and a soothing, rich object to perceive. So in this way, the imagery in the verse can be appreciated. And then the third element, neither of the commentators offer any specific elaboration on the third point, which is that the songs produced by Krishna's flute ornament the passages of the ears. So in other words, to say that they ornament the ears is to say that they are the best thing that you could use the ears to hear. Or, sometimes it's said that the ears of Vaishnavas are ornamented by Bhagavat Kotha. That, in other words, Vaishnavas don't wear ornaments on their ears. I mean, renunciates are Vaishnavas in a general sense. And thus, they're still said to have an ornament on the ear because they spend so much time with their ears hearing Kotha of Bhagavan. So to ornament the ears is to be the essence of what the ear hears, or the best object that the ear could possibly hear. So that the songs produced by your flute ornament the passages of the ears means that they're the most relishable things of all to hear. They are the perfection of the ears, or the beauty of having ears is realized in full by these songs. So the ears, the eyes, and the mouth are all being fulfilled, or their potential, their existence is being fully realized by hearing Krishna's flute song, by seeing Krishna's form, and by singing Krishna's name. So, we'll look further at other import conveyed by other words in the verse. So how is Krishna addressed in this verse? He's called vibho. So the address vibho, which can be understood simply as, O Master, in other words, the word vibho is sometimes, or most simply put, refers to, Lord or Master. However, the root vibho literally can convey one who has great power, or one who has a very pervasive presence. So it can also be understood to mean, O all-pervading one, or almighty one. So if, by having described Krishna's flute songs, Krishna's radiance, and Krishna's names, what relationship does this name or this address of Krishna as vibho have with those three elements? Because Rupa Goswami is not just going to use some arbitrary word to address Krishna here. He's going to address Krishna in some way that has some relationship with the rest of what he's conveying and trying to describe in the verse. So, this address, vibho, alludes to Sri Krishna's being all-pervasive by way of his names, form, that is, appearance or radiance, and flute songs, and to his all-powerfulness and supremacy being substantiated by the wonderful nature of, I think we need his names, form, and flute songs. So to say, you delight the mouth with your names, you delight the eyes with your radiance or with your form, and you delight the ears with your flute song, O all-pervading one, the implication is that your form is all-pervasive, which is, as is described by Jiva Gosvami, that the form of Bhagavan pervades every plane of existence at the subtlemost level. It's supremely all-pervasive. That Krishna's flute songs are also can be described as all-pervasive in that they enrich and fill the entire atmosphere. And the Venu Gita, the Yugal Gita beautifully describe these things. Rupa Goswami also has other poetry describing how Krishna during the Prakut Leela plays his flute and the sound, overwhelms the Gandharvas and Anantashesh and Brahma and Shiva and, is, bursting out of the shell of the universe and so forth. So the sound of the flute can be understood to be all-pervading, the form can be all-pervading, and this extraordinary manifestation of Krishna's names can be considered all-pervading because that name can be heard and appear on everyone's mouth simultaneously. Can be present anywhere, always, in the form of the singing of his name. So the sense can be taken in that of pervasiveness, that with your names, with your radiance or your form, and with your songs, you pervade the whole of the atmosphere. In other words, you're creating all this delight, you're enabling us to perfect the existence of our eyes, our ears, and our mouth, and you're doing so in an all-pervading way. Or it can be taken in the sense of capability or power. So the greatest power that Krishna exerts is not just the power to manifest a universe or destroy a universe or pick up Govardhan Hill, so to speak. The greatest power that he exerts is that of his akarshan, right? His attractive power, his ability to captivate even all the other forms of Bhagavan himself. To attract ordinary people in the world, that's not that great. But to attract even devas, to attract even rishis, to attract even Mahavishnu, to attract even Narayan, this is really a power of attraction. So how does Krishna do that? The sound of his flute, the beauty of his figure, the sweetness of his names, these things are even attractive to the most otherwise powerful and exalted and satisfied entities that exist in all planes, spiritual, material, what have you. So he ultimately shows, or he's seen to be almighty or all-powerful by the intensity of the attractiveness, the intensity of the sweetness that he exudes or emanates and gives people the chance to experience. So that's a further import of addressing Krishna here as vibho. So now we come to the humility part, or having praised and described Krishna in such a wonderful way, then what is the feeling in the heart of Rupa Goswami, the author in this case? How is it that this is an expression of humility? That comes in the last line of the verse, after these initial points are made. And he introduces that emotion, if you will, of this disconcertion or this heartache that he feels by using the particle Hanta, which you could render it in English as something like alas, or a sound that conveys the spirit of humility. So why is it that remembrance, or this description of all the beauty of Krishna, the wonderful attractive power of Krishna, how is it that that's related to, or why is that giving rise to this expression of humility? So that's what we'll discuss now. One other little point is that the word here, means in regard to the three objects described in the verse, namely Sri Krishna's names, radiance or form, and flute songs. So, when the compiler says that his aspiration, that is longing, for these objects, quote, does not shine, the basic sense is that he does not experience the fulfillment of his longing. That is, he does not attain any genuine perception of these objects, much less the, quote, festival for the mouth and so forth that can emerge from genuinely perceiving them. So, to remember something that's extremely wonderful can be a happy thing, but to remember both how wonderful something is and the fact that one doesn't have that thing or has long wanted it and yet to achieve it, that can also be an expression of heartache or an expression of distress. So by saying that this longing of mine does not shine means still, as wonderful as those things are, I haven't had that experience. I haven't had that joy that the name, that the form, that the flute song can fill the heart with. So that's a basic sense. A further, more poignant sense of this aspiration being said to, quote, not shine, is that it does not appear impressive and rather evokes the feeling of humility, that is a feeling of heartache, unsuccessfulness, and disconcertion, along with some degree of embarrassment. Or in other words, if Krishna is so gracious, and he is ready to grant these things to his bhaktas, and I've tried and wanted these things for a long time, and yet to ever receive them, then that implies that there's something in me that's disqualifying me from being blessed with these things. In other words, there's some fault, some hang-up, some unfavorable or untoward element that's still residual in me. And thus, being reminded of that, feeling the presence of that, then there is heartache, there's a sense of unsuccessfulness, there can even be a sense of embarrassment or, shame for the offenses or the wrongs or the naughtiness that one may continue to harbor within oneself. The compiler indicates the reason for this aspiration, that is longing, being said to not shine, by referring to persons like himself as we from whose minds kama has not receded. So why is it that this desire I have for this most beautiful things, the sight of Krishna, the sound of Krishna, the sweetness of Krishna's name, why am I not getting these things even though I want them? Because I don't want them one-pointedly. I don't truly want them. I still want other things too. Or my psyche is still conditioned by so many samskaras for so many other things based on this beginningless immersion in samsara that is my destiny. And as a result, still desires for other things crop up in the mind time and time and time again. And thus, because my mind is distracted, thwarted, and so forth by the presence of kama, I have yet to become so pure as to be blessed with a revelation of this direct perception of Krishna. I've yet to become, quote, akantik, or one-pointed upon him, or purely devoted to him, however you want to describe it. So for that reason, my aspiration doesn't shine, or it doesn't look well, so to speak. There's some contradiction in my character. There's some contradiction in my behavior. The implication is that kama is antipodal to the, quote, love, praṇaya, that is prema, which was described earlier in the verse, as the means by which genuine perception of Krishna's name, radiance, and flute songs comes about. So Baladev Vidyabhushan made this point, that the name becomes a festival in the mouth or dances on the tongue when one has prema. But I don't have prema. My mind is still full of kama. So therefore, I'm not experiencing this festival of the mouth or this profound experience of chanting Krishna's name that those with prema do. Because kama and prema are antipodal or antithetical to each other, as is shown here in this passage I quote from the Charitamrita. The desire to please one's own senses, that we call kama, and the desire to please Krishna's senses bears the name prema. Therefore, there is a vast difference between kama and prema. Kama is like blinding darkness, and prema is like a taintless sun. So, what you call a black and white distinction, or a, night and day distinction. Kama and prema are two opposite things. What is the, quote, in the language of Jiva Gosvami, tatparya that one has? What is the real intent that one has in whatever pursuit or desire one fosters or action one performs? Is it the satisfaction of oneself, or is it the satisfaction of Krishna? This is what determines whether one's act is an act of kama or an act of prema. This is what determines whether it's, quote, pure or impure. And this is how even acts that are conventionally called kama, such as, engagement in romantic affairs, are actually prema in the case of the gopis. And Rupa Goswami thus explains that the word kama sometimes refers to the gopis' acts of prema. And of course, that has to be understood carefully in context when the word kama is referring to the light or when it's referring to the darkness, so to speak. So, to the extent that kama remains present in the mind, a bhakta lacks prema, and thus the ability to genuinely perceive Sri Krishna's name, radiance, and flute songs. So it's prema that enables one to truly perceive these things. In the absence of prema, one doesn't truly perceive them. The absence of prema means the presence of kama, because everyone in the world is saddled with kama. Kama is said to be the one and only thing that binds people in samsara. So when one is bound by that kama, then one doesn't have prema, and thus one does not experience Krishna's name, radiance, and flute songs in their truly relishable form. So the compiler states this principle in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu, quote, as long as the obstinacy of desire for enjoyment, or mukti, pervades the heart, how can the emergence of the happiness of bhakti occur there? How can this joy of the festival of Krishna's name take place in the heart, when there isn't prema, in the mouth, when there isn't prema in the heart, or in other words, when there's kama in the heart? So, hearing this, we might say, well then how do we get the kama out? If it's only by prema that we can have this experience, if it's only by prema that we can truly perceive Krishna, then we need prema. And to get prema, we need to get rid of kama. So, how do we get rid of the kama? This is an urgent matter. It is thus incumbent upon every bhakta who longs to genuinely perceive Sri Krishna's name, radiance, and flute songs to purge the mind of kama. And Bhagavan Sri Krishna describes the process by which this is accomplished in Srimad Bhagavatam. So Krishna knows this very well, and he has graciously summarized how to do so in his teachings to Uddhava. So these are some well-known verses in this regard. Quote, one who has shraddha in discussions of me is disinterested in all karmas, that is, in all activities that are unrelated to me, and knows that desires, or kama, are full of suffering, that is, are invariable causes of suffering. Quote, although they may produce a semblance or temporary sensation of pleasure somewhere along the way. Ultimately, and on the whole, they're causes of suffering. So despite them being suffering, yet one is still unable to relinquish them. Or in other words, the psyche is still conditioned by the meager, flickering, faulty pleasure that they produce, such that perpetually thought and drive towards experiencing them again is recurrent in the psyche, and thus one struggles to ever let go of them. So what should one in this condition do? One should thereafter worship me, being affectionate, full of shraddha, and of firm resolve, while both acceding to and condemning those desires. So Krishna himself is acknowledging people are not immediately going to be giving them up. People are not immediately going to be able to overcome all this psychological conditioning that they have. But what can they do? They can continue to go about some of those things that they can't give up, but in a way that doesn't exacerbate the psychological conditioning towards remaining attached to them, or that in a way that doesn't further nourish the samskaras and the vasana for those things, that perpetuates the difficulty that one feels in letting go of those things. So how does one do that? By, quote, condemning those desires, the consequences of which are only ultimately suffering. In other words, going through the experience of those things, but doing so attentively, doing so alertly, or with awareness of how that experience that might be temporarily pleasurable somewhere along the way has a greater detrimental influence upon the quality of one's life. And by going through it with that layer of psychological detachment and that awareness of both the greater purpose or the greater desire that one wants to pursue and the detriments that come about from continuing to act upon that lesser desire, then gradually the samskar, the vasana for such things, wanes off. So Chakravarti Pad, I'm adding a little bit here. He uses this interesting phrase, nindami cha, pibami cha, in his commentary on these verses, which means, I criticize and I drink. In other words, I tell myself it's not good and then I do it anyway, but not in a way that I therefore consider it good, but that I go through it, but nevertheless I retain the awareness of it not being an ideal thing to be doing or to have a negative consequence. So, how does that going through these activities or dealing with one's psychology in this way, how does it help you, or what is the ultimate result of applying these teachings? He says, all desires, situated in the heart, are destroyed when the heart of a devotee worshipping me continuously, by means of the aforestated practice of bhakti, becomes fixed upon me. So the more that one is attentive to, aware of, fixing the mind, one pointed in the mind upon Krishna, the more and more the presence and influence of these desires in the mind will wane and go down. And all the desires are destroyed when one comes to that point of being fixed in, having the mind fixed completely upon me. So in other words, manmana bhava, be of mind fixed on me. Try to fix the mind on Bhagavan, try to engage in activities related to Bhagavan, and gradually, by that positive effort, as well as this process described in these 3 verses to deal with the negative obstacles that one deals with, by the combination of the two, gradually the samskar for bhakti deepens, the samskar for other things wanes, the psyche becomes reconditioned, and ultimately can be purged of kama, or purified. Sri Jiva Pad explains in this regard that in essence it is bhakti itself that shall burn away kama from the heart of a sadhaka, and elsewhere also elucidates one of the primary ways that this takes place. When an aspirant struggles with the presence of kama in the heart, because of the obstruction that it creates to sadhana, then bhakti in the form of humility becomes enkindled in the sadhaka's heart, meaning that the disturbance to one's sadhana resulting from the residual presence of kama in the heart is transformed into an impetus for further engagement in bhakti sadhana. Because the, quote, heartache and disconcertion, which is how Sanatana Gosvami has glossed the idea of humility, or dainya, one feels in the midst of that struggle, gives rise to further remembrance of Sri Bhagavan and prayer to Sri Bhagavan. The verse, I think I need a comma here. The verse under discussion being a primary example of such a prayer. So this is like Aikido or Jiu-Jitsu, or I don't know what martial art it is, but this idea that something that's coming to harm you, that force can be redirected in a way back on itself, in a way that negates that attack upon oneself. So when these disturbing elements are there in the psyche and they're causing disturbance to the focus that we want to achieve, the experience of observing those disturbances can become a cue to further remember Bhagavan or pray to Bhagavan as a result of feeling disturbed, and in that way, that disturbance turns into a trigger which engages one back in the thing that one wants to be doing, namely thinking of Bhagavan, worshipping Bhagavan, and so on. So this humility that's felt, or this lack of success, or this disturbance that's felt within oneself as a result of these disturbances arising, can itself become a means, or is itself one way of responding to that then absorbs one in bhakti rather than activities that further nourish those disturbing elements. So this is Jiva Goswami's insightful point and the background to what is said here. So the point on the whole, again, is that this desire that we have for the experience of Krishna's name, Krishna's form, Krishna's flute songs will not succeed as long as we have the presence of kama within the mind. So when we have that presence of kama, then our longing, quote, doesn't shine. In other words, it doesn't bear fruit, and it doesn't look so good, or, it looks a bit flawed, so to speak, when you're on the one hand wanting this, and then from time to time the mind is flickering back and fostering a desire for something else, and maybe you're also acting on the desire for something else. That appears contradictory, just as we don't like it when people act one way and speak another way, when their words and actions don't match, or when they act sometimes in a way that we think is valuable and then other times is detrimental, and we find that this person's character behavior is inconsistent or unreliable. This is considered an undesirable characteristic in a person. So similarly, from Bhagavan's perspective, you have all these aspirants who on the one hand are praying and saying, give me mercy, give me service, let me have bhakti to you and all this. And then with the very same mind, with the very same body, with the very same mouth that they're saying these prayers and doing these activities for a certain period of the day or a certain amount of time, they're going off and doing things that have nothing to do with that or antithetical to that within a short period of time. So not exactly an impressive way to conduct oneself, so to speak. So in that way, it, quote, doesn't shine. Now, let's look at one last point. Baladeva Vibhushan offers a little bit different interpretation of this last compound. So Sri Vidyabhushan Pad also offers an alternate interpretation of the compound kāmānirvṛta-cetasām that further underscores this understanding. Quote, we whose minds are discontented because of the residual presence therein of kama, that is, desires for objects of the senses, vibho. So this reading of the word anirvṛta to mean discontented rather than, quote, non-receded, further conveys the spirit of humility expressed in the verse. In other words, it's one thing to say that the humility is conveyed in the verse because of one saying that one's aspiration doesn't shine. But what Baladeva Vibhushan Pad is saying that that's also conveying humility, and so is this compound by simply saying that our minds are morose, or our minds are discontented because we feel the presence of kama within ourselves. So a common person, kama is the cause of their pleasure. They're not thinking there's anything wrong or anything problematic about having kama in the mind. They might even like having kama in the mind. They might be depressed if they don't feel any kama and just feel morose. And they say, I wish I had some desires and some wish to live because that's how I would get some enjoyment in my life. So, there's even, a state of where the presence of kama in the mind is a cause of happiness. But yet for a bhakta, Baladeva Vibhushan Pad is saying that the presence of kama in the mind is a cause of discontent, because they know that kama is antithetical to the object that they truly aspire to achieve, namely bhava, the object of sadhana, or more loosely, prema. So because they feel the residual presence of that binding antithetical element within their own psyche, that gives rise to a sense of discontent or a sense of uneasiness within oneself, which can be described as humility, or that is itself one expression or manifestation of what we call dainya. Sri Vidyabhushan Pad also adds that an additional purport in this case is that the compiler conveys to Sri Krishna, quote, being sheltering and gracious, you alone are the basis of our deliverance from this condition. So in other words, by saying our aspiration doesn't shine or our aspiration doesn't prove successful, one way of taking that is thus we're not going to succeed without you, without you giving grace to us, without you giving shelter to us, without you helping us, we're never going to succeed at this. So that statement can then be interpreted as having a suggestive meaning of seeking or praying for and longing for the shelter of Bhagavan. This sense accords with an explanation of Sri Jiva cited earlier, that the act of a bhakta fostering the affirmation, quote, Sri Krishna alone is my shelter, is itself an expression of bhakti in the form of humility. Sri Jiva makes this point specifically in regard to Gajendra. So Gajendra was being attacked by the crocodile, he's fighting for a long time, finally he realizes by his own strength he's never going to win, and he's actually going to lose and he's going to die. So he realizes, I cannot shelter myself, or I cannot protect myself. So he comes to the conclusion, you alone are my only shelter, or Krishna alone is my only shelter in this situation. So just that state of humility, or that state of feeling oneself to be shelterless and thus dependent upon or able to recognize Bhagavan as one's only shelter, just even having that cognition is itself a form of bhakti. In other words, and then you have to go do a ritual, and then he did bhakti. Not. Just even that realization within oneself and that formation of the affirmation within the heart that Krishna is my shelter, that itself is an act of bhakti. As Sanatana Pad defines Sharanagati in Hari Bhakti Vilas as Bhagavadiyo Ham, that I belong to Bhagavan. Just having this awareness is, in essence, Sharanagati. Or here, that he is my shelter. Just that awareness is an expression of Sharanagati, or is an expression of humility, because Karpanya is one of the 6 limbs of Sharanagati, as we'll get to soon. So, interestingly, this expression, or this instance, that Baladeva Vibhushan gives as the purport of this verse, which mirrors this expression which Jiva Gosvami says is the essence of what Gajendra's act of devotion was. So, in other words, this verse ends with a purport, a suggestive meaning that relates to the essence of the Gajendra Upakyan, or the essence of what is to be learned, or what was the Sharanagati shown in the case of Gajendra. Rupa Goswami, writing this verse, which has this import, then in the very next verse of the text, presents another verse of his own in which he compares his mind to Gajendra, or he goes exactly further on the theme of identifying the state of the mind of a bhakta in humility with the plight or the situation of Gajendra. So, Sri Rupa offers a prayer in humility to Bhagavan, wherein he compares the condition of his own mind to that of Gajendra. So, that we'll get to next time, or having discussed this verse and taken up our hour, then we'll get to another verse where we get into more specifics about that psychological state, or what are the primary elements going on in the mind that give rise to or churn out this thing called humility or dainya from the heart of a bhakta, and how other lessons can be gleaned from the plight that Gajendra faced in comparison to the plight that a jiva in general faces within samsara as a whole. So that will be the discussion next time. I'll conclude here for today. If anyone has any comment, question, correction, or anything otherwise, welcome to share.
Jayaraj, I would like to have a question.
Okay.
At the beginning, you were describing a position on psychology of advanced Vaishnavas, who, despite of being very advanced, they feel completely incapable or not worthy of what they are. But my question, and you were saying that those who compare this to example of sports or people who practice any sorts of art or skill. As the more they practice, to become more capable and more worthy of themselves and so on. So I understand the example where what it's supposed to present, but it's not really like matching, because the expression of the Vaishnavas we hear is like self-denouncing, self-worth is like it's not that they express. I mean, there's one point is happiness or joy, but at the same time, in some prayers or expressions, is that they are completely full of material desires. How is it possible to I'm reading Padyavali, and all the first songs, or many songs, are describing author Narottam Thakur as completely devoid of anything. Yet he describes the love they have for Bhagavan and joy in other song, completely from as if somebody else wrote it. You know what I mean to say? Is that at one point they feel like incapable, and at the same time they have this great sense of appreciation, and as if they express that I attain, I'm there, I am, this joy of having Bhagavan as their own, and expressing their love for Bhagavan, which is the goal of life. And another song, they say, I'm not worthy, I'm useless, I'm not capable, or I don't have anything, I'm just simply materialist. I think we've discussed this in the past, but it's just this clashes in my mind. How it can be, and it's not like they faking it; they actually feel that way. So, and sometimes commentators or expression or those who comment on this the economy, they may say that they show example for us to follow. But even that doesn't really appeal to me as explanation of the expressions, those lowly expressions of themselves. Would you able to just
if I may, this is precisely a topic which I discuss in detail in a commentary that comes either on the next verse or the verse after that. Mm-hmm. So you're right on theme, and we'll definitely get into that in detail coming soon. Mm-hmm. I've presented discussion of 3 different verses of Prahlad Maharaj, in which he expresses apparently exact opposite sentiments a few verses after each other. And how the commentators reconcile these things is very interesting. And this is also a point that Baba has shown interest in, and we've discussed on a number of occasions. So it's a very valuable subject matter. So rather than saying it all now and then again discussing it in one class later, I'll just give you the very nutshell of the whole thing. Is a phrase of Jiva Gosvami that he ends his whole discussion of it by saying Bhavanam vichitra gati tvat. That this is the wonderful movement of bhavas, or the unfolding waves of a variety of bhavas, give rise to this diversity. So
there's a bhavana vichitra, how does it say?
Bhavanam vichitra gatitvat.
Gatitva, okay.
So we'll discuss that and other interesting points related to that very soon.
Thank you. Okay, I'll be waiting patiently. And thank you for continuing or restarting the classes. We were waiting for a long time for that continuation. Thank you.
Oh, my pleasure. I've done it as quick as I can. Just today I finished this present prakaran, so I have some material in the midst of various other things, and it's a great joy for me to spend time on Sri Rupa Goswami's Padyavali, without doubt.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Pranam, Jai Radhe.
Yes, I see another hand.
Jai Shri Radhe. Pranam Baba. Thank you very much for this beautiful class. I'm also very, very happy that Padyavali classes has resumed right now. Thank you very much. I have a question. I just want to make sure I understood it correctly. A question about the radiance of Shri Krishna's figure. Did I understand correctly that not only the Krishna's figure itself has the deep blue hue as a raincloud, but also the radiance or the light which comes from his figure, not like white or yellow light like we see from the sun, for example, but actually the light which comes from Krishna's figure also has the deep blue color, like blue light. Is that correct? Or
yeah, we can say like that. It's some, it's blue. In some cases, it's also described as glossy or having some sheen to it. So, like in paint, they have like matte colors and then like sheen tones and glossy tones. So it might, it's deep blue like a cloud, but with some gloss in there as well, perhaps.
So did I understand it correctly? So it's can I imagine it as like white light having a deep blue hue, or is it color itself has the deep blue color and then it has like a white hue, or which one is predominant? Is it like a blue light or a white light with the deep blue hue in it, or?
Well, I mean, as the verse is describing, the most common example is the rain cloud. So the rain cloud has, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but at least my aesthetic experience of it is that the light is not exactly white. The light is colored, but there might be some shimmering or some richness within that, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Wow, very nice. I was very surprised to hear that the light itself is blue, because before today I was somehow imagining the radiance which comes from Krishna's body to be like a radiance of the sun, like this white or yellow, and I am so surprised that it's actually blue. Thank you very much for this discovery. I'm so happy.
Well, may your eyes and mind be soothed by the radiance of Sri Krishna. May the soothing radiance of Sri Krishna always protect you.
Thank you. Jai Radhe, thank you so much.
All right, well, I'll conclude there for today. Vaishnavibhyo namo namo. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe.
Jai.
Jai.